Hey YouTube, welcome back. We've been playing an awful lot of Frostclaw recently. I think I'm finally about to play something that isn't Frostclaw after about 1 month of playing just one skill and nothing else at all. So in order to wrap it up, we're going to make one more little video here talking about what we've been doing on this particular skill. If you've seen elsewhere on my YouTube channel, you know that we had the Frostbite version, which is my personal favorite one. And then the second one was a Morning Frost Claw build, like using Morning Frost, Frost Claw, and then using a Mad Alchemist Ladle, and that is excellent. I think it's really good. My favorite one is the Frostbite. Since then, we've tried some other stuff, and I'll show you what this particular build is, but I want to talk about the other thing first, and then we'll do some rambling about Frostclaw in the meantime. So I played a build for a hot minute that was called Green Frostclaw, because it used some items that you might not know exist in the game, because they're green. So we were trying to play like Lightning, or I guess we were trying to play Mad Alchemist Ladle, because Mad Alchemist Ladle is a very, very strong item, and we were thinking, okay, Mad Alchemist Ladle works really well with Morning Frost, because Morning Frost provides a lot of flat damage to go along with Mad Alchemist Ladle, but what if you wanted to not deal cold damage? What if you want to deal lightning damage or fire damage? So fire damage, we were thinking about using the belt that gives you flat fire damage per ignite on you. Let me see if I can find one here real quick as I chat about this. Oh, I guess I have it over here, don't I? Immolator's Ablation. So there's up to 40 flat damage, which is really, really high for the belt slot. But to me, I don't think you can play Frostclaw as a DPS skill without using Volley of Glass. If you're taking Volley of Glass, it means you're pathing through Bright Frost, which means you're cleansing yourself, which means you're never stacking up ignites on yourself. So I think the fire stuff never really took off. I was interested in using a Firestarter's torch along with it, like maybe a Cinder Song as well. There were some ideas there, but I couldn't really find like a crit fire thing that I wanted to play. So in enter another source of flat lightning damage, and it actually led us away from using Mad Alchemist Ladle, and it led us into using Valatria's Downfall and Valatria's Stormcrown. So the Valatria set, normally you only see this during a Lightning Meteor Sork build, and what shocked me about this particular set of items is that they're actually good. It's weird. I don't like set items. I made a video about set items. I would like to use any kind of item other than this. However, you get enough base crit in Frostclaw that you don't need a base crit catalyst. And the best base type for you to use for staves would be a base type that has both flat melee damage and flat spell damage as the implicit modifier, but it still has the -3 spell mana cost. So the best base type for you to use if you're using a staff is the Valatria's Downfall, or sorry, is the Moon Staff here. And then the best Moon Staff for you to use is Valatria's, because it also gives you a bunch of flat damage for stacking intelligence. It gives you +1 and relevant stuff on your helmet as well. The fact that these ended up being like a very solid way of playing Lightning Frostclaw and building crit was sweet. You could use a Titan Heart with it. We ended up using a Static Shell because it has some other defensive and offensive attributes along with it. But this, I think it's worse than just playing Morning Frost, but Morning Frost has like a high gear requirement. You got to build a bunch of dexterity. It's hard to set up. But just from the get-go, this is a very, very easy build to put together, and it's good. So I was shocked by that. I'm just going to keep saying shocked. It's not a pun. So from this, we were discussing what to do with Frostclaw next, and a lot of people wanted to see what we could do with the nodes on the very bottom left of the tree. Let me hide my camera real quick so you can see exactly what's going on. So onto the snow here. Onto the snow adds an 8 mana cost, but it makes it bounce. This makes it bounce and aim. This makes it bounce back to you. So to me, the most interesting things about these nodes is the mana cost, I suppose, if you wanted to have a high mana cost skill. But more specifically, this node here, holding an alt, the chance is once per cast, not once per projectile. And this is a recast. So the fact that it's a recast means that if you take this node, you have a 42% chance twice to proc Elinova, and they can both happen. So if you have this node, and this node, and this node, you could potentially be procking Elinova 3 times per right click, which is extraordinarily expensive. You are probably interested in having not a -3, but maybe a -6 or a -5 scepter, or even -8 spell mana cost if you're using something like a fire starters, or -9 if you have a tier 7 modifier. You really want as much minus mana cost for those kinds of memes as possible. You could even be interested in using a Foot of the Mountain. Foot of the Mountain giving you a minus mana cost as you're standing still. And then you can combine this with using teleport, because when you use teleport, you don't count as moving. So you can maintain that the -6 mana cost for this. So there's a lot of really cool minus mana cost stuff you can do. So this led us into thinking, what can we do with Crit Ellie Nova? Because if we want Frostclaw to be our main source of damage, then we need to be taking Volley of Glass. That's my opinion. If you want Frostclaw to be dealing any damage itself in a capacity more than just a support skill, you got to have this node. So you can do this with Volley of Glass as long as you're standing still. It's annoying. I don't really enjoy it. It's very, very pretty. I highly recommend that you mess around with it if you have that kind of minus mana cost stuff, especially if you have some mana regeneration on your gear. I think it's more of a meme. It's really, really pretty, but I think it's a meme. So while we were thinking about what we can do with Elemental Nova as a primary source of damage, we were thinking, okay, what if Frostclaw was just for support? What if it wasn't for damage? So what if we weren't taking Volley of Glass and we were taking this? Well, then the interaction that it has with Celestial Conflux proccing Elemental Nova is a bit more interesting. So we could have like 2 or maybe even 3 casts of Elemental Nova per right click of Frostclaw. And then it also gives us utility of cleansing and applying ailments and being a low mana cost skill, maybe being a 0 mana cost skill, but it does stuff for us. It's fine. We can also convert it, but we'll talk about that later. So we were thinking about, we could use Frostclaw to proc Elemental Nova, and we could have basically two different ways of building damage. You could either go crits, which is what we ended up doing here, or you could go for spark charges. I know it looks like we have spark charges here, but realistically, if you're going to go spark charges, you would go for Fragment of the Enigma, and then you would just go all in on spark charges. I don't think that's a good choice. I've seen other builds that are fine, but it wasn't what I was interested in, because I thought I could do better just having Elemental Nova deal damage itself. So that's how we ended on this particular build. So this is a cold damage build. Maybe 90% of our damage is cold damage. I know it looks like our damage is all over the place. We've got lightning stuff, we have spark charges, we have fireballs, we got all this shit, but it's mostly cold damage. So, you know what? Let's hop into 550 corruption. We'll take let's see, enrage, glancing blows, and some damage. And let's see how this build looks, and then we'll talk about the workings of this build. Oh, and then we'll grab some loot as long as we're with it. So, grab some of this, grab some of that. Grab my sunglasses so I can actually see where the minimap is on the screen. So we are still using CFC. We're still using Rowan's Frostguard. So that thing gives us 300-ish ward per second. It gives us a burst of ward. It has a chance of giving us a second burst of ward. What else is going on interesting with it? And then it gives us, of course, the 30% damage reduction. So between CFC and having Flame Ward spec'd and generating a bunch of ward using Frostclaw and the various nodes in the mastery, we're pretty tanky. It's hard to go wrong in terms of defensive stats when you have that suite of defenses available to you. So for the offense of the build, I said that we're mostly cold damage. The bulk of our damage is still coming from Frostclaw. But the Elemental Novas hit pretty hard. They kind of look like a crit. If you're only watching the monster's health bar, you'll see that when the Elemental Novas go off, it's very, very noticeable. That's tier 7 intelligence. Ooh la la, look at that. And more so than any of the other builds that I've played so far for Frostclaw, this one definitely feels like it has the best clear speed. Like, we not only have Frostclaw, but we also have spark charges. We have our Elemental Novas that are going off 42% of the time. And we even have room in this build for proccing our Ice Barrage as well. Ice Barrage is doing a couple things, including giving us a more cold damage modifier, which helps because, again, about 90% of our damage is cold damage, even though it doesn't really look like that when you're just looking at the build visually speaking. So let's talk about what's going on here. I think the most interesting parts of this build are... I was leveling this item up. Pay no attention to this item. Pretend like we actually have our other ring on. So what's actually going on in this build is we're using a -5 Frozen Ire. This is the same one that I had on a Frostbite character, but we're just happen to be using it here as well. And it's still good for crit because it still has a bunch of flat spell cold damage on it. So this thing has 63 flat spell cold damage, but it also happens to have 43 melee cold damage. And that melee cold damage, by taking Glamdring, most of that is going to convert over into, what do you call it? Over into flat spell damage as well. You're going to see that I have +5 on my Frostclaw. As we're talking about this build, we can trim 1, 2, 3, 4, because if you're playing this build with low gear investment, you will still have a Twisted Heart. You will not have a +4 Twisted Heart. So you're going to take off 1, 2, 3, 4. You just won't have the Glamdring node, and you won't have any points in Cold Star. The skill tree is kind of stretched to do exactly what we're trying to do here. Yeah, that's pretty much it. So it's very, very interesting stuff. So for Frostclaw, let's talk about the cold damage, fire damage stuff real quick, because I think you could yoink this idea and use it in a different build. So it's important to talk about this first of all. One of my favorite things to do in Last Epoch is to force your skill to deal a different sort of damage by using a different base type. So for example, if we jump over here and type in Marinara, we see that a Marina's Lost Soul, the implicit is spell necrotic damage, and the explicit is also spell necrotic damage. So you can put a whole bunch of spell necrotic damage on a skill, even if it happens not to be a necrotic skill. So then you can still just scale necrotic damage and take necrotic shred, for example. So for us, we have a bunch of cold damage. The base damage of Frostclaw is 20. So we're converting that 20 damage into fire damage, but there's a reason for that. If you wanted to deal more damage, you simply wouldn't convert, and then all of your damage would be cold instead of most of your damage being cold. But our scalars are mostly spell damage, cast speed, crit chance, crit multi, and then we have cold shred. So we're not really missing out on too much there. But more to the point, why are we converting this into a fire tag if we're not scaling fire damage? Well, the answer is over in Rune Master. If we have a skill that we can spam that has the fire tag on it, then we can gain Rune Word Inferno. And this gives us a little bit of flat fire damage. Sure. Much more importantly, it gives us a more armor per shock while we have this active. So this is more armor per shock on the attacker. This does not show up on your tooltip. It does not scale things like Runic Fortress, for example, because it doesn't show up on your tooltip, doesn't show up on your character sheet, but it does apply when the enemy hits you as long as they are shocked. So what does this mean? Well, we have a fire skill, and we have our Elemental Nova as well, but we also want to be applying as many shocks as possible in order to take advantage of the more armor multiplier. So in enter Osirian. My Osirian happens to be 1 LP. You could do this exact same thing with 0 LP. You do not need LP on an Osirian to take advantage of this interaction. What's the interaction? It's got shock chance on it. That's the interaction. So we need shock chance somewhere. It also happens to give us more damage. Wait a minute, that's probably a typo. It gives us 10% more damage because shock stacks up to 10. So this is 10% more damage. It gives us shock as well. It gives us some chill at duration. It's not an OP ring, but it fits what we're doing for this particular build very, very well, because we don't really have other ways of getting shock, especially if you're using a Frozen Ire. Maybe you could get it on Amulet. Maybe you can get it on a Suffix on a Scepter if you're using not a legendary thing here. But yeah, getting shock somewhere is important. All right, so we want shock on the enemy because we get more armor. It turns out we would also like to shock the enemy because we want to get more armor. The body armor slot is very flexible. You could use any number of things. I have this static shell here because I was previously using it along with the Vatrio set to get as much intelligence as possible. But it turns out that just using a static shell on any build, maybe not any build, but like a lot of builds, allows you to get a ton of armor. So all of a sudden we have one more multiplier for armor. It's 100% more, so it basically doubles your armor. It goes up to 175. Holy crap. And then we also have the Runeward Inferno, which is a second more multiplier for your armor. And then we have Throne of Ambition, which is conveniently fire and cold, hitting both of our damage types for the damage, and gives us more armor multiplier. So we have 3 separate more armor multipliers. So normally something like Isidora's is a nice thing to have because it's got cast speed and it's got armor and percent armor, but all of a sudden the value of having so much flat armor, going from 1300 to 2100 flat armor just by this belt slot, is it's multiplied with 3 separate more multis for your armor, which is just awesome. It's so cool in terms of defenses. I've been using this pair of gloves, the swaddling with tier 7 cast speed on them, on many of my characters because they feel so good. However, getting something that's not a Weaver's Will item, if you were using like a normal exalted item, it would also allow you to get a armor applies to damage over time. The only things that have ever killed me on this character are damage over time. First of all, because I spend a lot of time reading Twitch chat. I get distracted. But second of all, because we have so much armor, we have a lot of damage mitigation against hits. Flame Ward, 2 of the damage multipliers, 2 of the DRs in Flame Ward are against hits. One of them is against Elemental. So things like Necrotic or Void damage over time, especially if they're not pools and they're like targeted damage over time, they hit like a truck, especially if you're not looking at the screen. So damage over time is something you care about, and it's a strong reason to consider going armor applies to dot on a pair of exalted gloves instead of using swaddling here like I've used for the other characters. So that is a long-winded answer for why we're doing the cold damage, ignite, shock, stacking, 3 separate armor multipliers thing. So what else matters to you? The other bit is the helmet. So the helmet is a Crest of Unity. It has less damage taken from ignited, shocked, or chilled enemies, which is great. Love having that kind of thing. But we also happen to be an Elemental Nova build. So for Elemental Nova, the most relevant thing here, because we are playing a crit Ele Nova build along with crit Frostclaw, is that we want to take the Shatter Nova here on the very far left side. So in case you haven't seen a node like this in Last Epoch before, this is 4 separate more multipliers. This is not 30, 60, 90, 120. This is like 170 or 180 or something. Maybe somebody in Twitch chat can give me the exact number for how much more damage this is. But assuming that you can shock, ignited, chilled, that's, 120-ish% more damage. You're probably not freezing things, but because we have so much cold damage and we have some relevant freeze rate multi, we can actually freeze monsters as well, which is probably not going to be a boss. You would like to be able to fit in. It's 185 for all of them. God bless you, Twitch chat. You would like to be able to fit in Snap Freeze, because Snap Freeze allows you to get the 30% more damage into Elemental Nova, and it also gives you 30% more damage on your Frostclaw. You can fit it in as long as you are willing to rebind buttons, because you need Cold Fire Cold in order to get the CFC Rowan's Frost Guard here from your Runic Invocation. But I have, I guess I should explain how CFC or how Runic Invocation works, because some people are asking about it. I have Cold Fire Cold right here. I have Blank on Teleport, so it gets skipped. I have Cold on Flame Ward, which very notably gives us flat armor here, which is a ton of flat armor. So we have C, and then we have Skip, and then Runic Invocation always skips itself, because remember, in Runic Invocation, if you hold down Alt, it says, this effect ignores Runic Invocation itself when looking at the abilities on your bar, very last line of text. So Skip, Cold, Skip, Skip, Fire, and then it loops back around. Skip, Cold. So it's Cold, Fire, Skip, 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 wrap back around, Cold, CFC. So that's how that works. If you were willing to rebind your the keys on your bar, keys on your bar, you could like Flame Ward on Q, Frostclaw on W, and then your E could be Snap Freeze, and then Snap Freeze would make your build strictly deal more damage than my build does. I just like using right click because I'm an old grumpy man. Cool, so that describes roughly what's going on there. We have a little bit of hybrid penetration coming in from Crest of Unity. It's like 25 or so, but most of our damage is cold, so that is not too important for us. The last couple points in Elemental Nova you could take out 5 points and go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then trim like 1 point out of AoE and take Infernal Nova instead. This would make your Elemental Novas way, way bigger than mine, and it's quite fun to play with. However, you would have a 7% more damage multiplier, a bunch of garbage, and some AoE. Whereas my particular build has a 20% more multiplier, and it also has spark charges, which are dealing a relevant amount of damage for a build here. So there's like 100% chance to apply spark charge on hit. I think it's worthwhile. Remember, spark charges have a tiny bit of flat damage to them, but we're adding a bunch of cold. So even this is taking advantage of our cold shred, and it's dealing a substantial portion of our cold damage. Or I guess substantial cold damage relative to its own damage. Overall damage. So you could trim some points to get bigger AoE if you wanted to, but I like how this was set up here. I guess I can briefly show you what the skills are looking like. I feel like I've been staring at Frostclaw for the past month, because I have been. So here's what's going on here. There should be 1 more point in copied scrolls. This got messed up at some point. Trim 1 point here, put another point in copied scrolls, because you want 4 points there. For Frostclaw, we have 3 points in Elemental Nova. All the minus mana cost. We convert to fire because of the armor bit. We take Volley of Glass because we're trying to deal damage. And we take Ice Barrage because it is a spell that gives us more cold damage. It's less cold damage taken, which helps to mitigate the Cryomatic Fragility from Elemental Nova. It also gives us some cast speed periodically. It hits. It's got a shield on it. It helps clear monsters. It's just a nice thing to fit into the build. And we don't need anything else because we're using an unspec'd teleport. Flame Ward, we need a cold skill, so we convert to cold. We take all the armor here. All the less damage taken, and +1 charge on the top right side. I think that about does it for that. For our items themselves, Crest of Unity could have plus levels to Elemental Nova, or it could just have Intelligence. I think Intelligence is probably a better way to go because it's more flexible for other builds, but plus levels to Elemental Nova. It's a good meme, so maybe you could try that out as well. The Static Shell, I think the Intelligence is a good flexible thing to have. It's good for this build. Might not be best in slot, but it's pretty good because Intelligence is really good these days. If for nothing else, in giving you ward retention. I want my ward builds to have over 400% ward retention. So 100 Intelligence gives you 400 ward retention by itself. Then it also gives you cooldown, percent increased damage, and spell crits. And then sometimes it gives you other things for your build as well. Our rings, we have a bunch of Intelligence and spell damage. The Swaddling, we talked about these gloves already, things you can possibly replace them with. Hover over the amulets, some armor shreds, spell crit, and critical strike multiplier. Our crit chance on this build, our tooltip is 72. With Frostclaw, our crit is capped because we have +8 there. On our Elemental Nova, we have +3, so this brings us to about 94-ish% chance to crit. If you wanted to put more crit in your build or trim some out, just know about like my particular setup here. With 1, let's see, 1? It's just 1. No, it's 2. Yeah, I have 2 sources of percent increased spell crit. So I've got tier 5 here and tier 5 here. And that puts my Elemental Nova at like 94-ish% chance to crit. For our belts, we have Isidora's because it's a bunch of armor. Our boots are a very, very flexible spot. Something like Fortify for the reduced damage we're taking from crits, I think is great because it goes along well with the Rune Master Mastery. And then a Twisted Heart, it's got +4 on it, but you do not need that. You'll have less damage than me, but listen, it's a high-end build, and it's not as good as Morning Frost. And I don't think it's as good as the Frostbite stuff either. But it's very cool, and I've really enjoyed playing it, and it's got some really interesting moving pieces along with this build. Especially the armor stuff. The armor stuff makes me really happy. For the blessings, we have Crit Multi here, percent cold damage from Lagin, all resistance because we don't need crit avoidance. We have Shred because a lot of our damage is cold damage, and then Flat Armor because Flat Armor is OP when it's getting multiplied so many separate times. So that's the build. Let's turn the camera back on here so that I can see you. We're going to move on to play something other than Frostclaw. I promise. We're not going to play Frostclaw anymore. But using this video as a time to talk about the Vatrio stuff and the fact that I'm just totally surprised that this item is good. Because I wasn't expecting that. And then how we transitioned from one idea to the next idea to the minus mana cost to the foot of the mountain to finally settling on this as an experiment for what else we can do while playing Frostclaw. It's been really enjoyable. So we're going to move on, probably do something with some 2 or maybe 3 LP Mad Alchemist Ladle, and learn more about what this class is all about. Cool. If you got questions, leave them in the comment section. I respond to most of them. I'll see you next time.